Ruhren, who is the Senior Director of Conservation at the Audubon Society of Rhode Island, and he's going to be presenting on algae today. Thank you, Scott.
Okay, thank you. Ryan gave me a horrible image and said these are Madonna mics. I can't replicate Madonna. So welcome. I have a short amount of time to get across a lot of information, and I definitely don't want to sit and read my board. But I want to ask a quick question. What type of image or perception or view do you have about algae? Anybody think about algae? The stormwater people.
Good and bad.
Sorry?
It's good and bad.
Good and bad. Yes. Good and bad. She's a plant in the audience. She's not my wife. Yeah, so I'm an ecologist, a botanist, plant ecologist, conservationist, so I think of algae as being a key part of the ecosystem. But the ones that make the news all the time, obviously, are the bad ones. I work with invasive plants, and obviously a lot of people know about invasive plants. There are invasive algae, too. Luckily, only about less than 1% of the true algal blooms are toxic. So there's algal blooms that are going on all the time. If you ever go down to Scarborough Beach and you get covered with all the polysiphonia, the red Twizzlers, that's not toxic, it just stinks. So it's the few that do cause problems, obviously, that we're concerned about. Some of them are deadly poison, like the gymnodidium, that will accumulate and kill manatees in bad years down in Florida. So algae are incredibly diverse in what they need, where they live. There's terrestrial algae, which people don't realize. There's algae that live in the hairs of polar bears and sloths. On the backs of turtles, there's a specialized algae. So I do want you to come away with the realization that they're an important part of the food chain. Algae are the base of the food web in most aquatic systems, marine and freshwater. So they are an integral part. And how the algae go, the rest of the community goes. So when there's a boom and they die off, what happens when they all die off is they deplete the oxygen. And by the time you see the dead fish in a cove somewhere, that's when it's a little too late. There's already been a problem. The other interesting thing about algae is how abundant and diverse they are. They actually generate way more oxygen than all the trees in the world. But no one's out there planting algae for obvious reasons. They also suck up more carbon than most of the trees worldwide. One reason is because they are so simple, they reproduce so quickly, you can get high biomass in a short amount of time, as opposed to planting 300 acres of red maple and waiting, for that to happen. So they are very, very important, but we're here to talk about stormwater issues, and this is a great setting because this is the type of pond that can quickly become eutrophic. It's small, it's shallow. So the types of things that lead to algal blooms, and that's a funny word too for people because algae don't flower, but it comes from a German word of growth, and we have an overabundance of something. So what are types of things you think that can cause algae to all of a sudden grow really fast?
Excess nutrients.
Exactly, nutrients. Temperature, yeah, rising temperatures. We think we're going to see more and more algal blooms with climate change, no surprise. Depth of water, which is influencing temperature too. If you think about like a stinky farm pond where you may have fished for pickerel as a kid, typically in late summer it's full of algae. It might even be carpeted with a film like that on top. That's because they're shallow, they heat up fast, they're in a basin, just like here. So basin, as you all know with stormwater people, that's going to collect and then flush, hopefully, but a lot of times all the nutrients come in and the temperature's rising. It's very open. Those of you who might be fish people, what type of water do trout like?
Cold.
Cool, and cool water carries more oxygen than warm water. So one of the problems with water bodies where there's no trees around is they warm up. It's bad for a lot of the sensitive species like fish, invertebrates, and others. Okay, so algae, very important, but when we screw up systems, you have these influx of nutrients, animal waste, fertilizers, pesticides that might disrupt the balance. We end up with an algal bloom. Some algae bloom are natural. They're not all human caused. So some ponds, you may get a massive growth of this filamentous green algae called hydrodictyon. You may have seen it grows in big filamentous mats. And that's typical. It rises in the summer, and then it dies. Okay, so there always have been increases of algae in systems. It's just that when you do disrupt that balance, that's what happens. So some of the things that we look for with algal blooms or things that happen is you get foul-tasting water. So people who are into drinking water processing, they may not be toxic, but it tastes funky. You may even notice that in your own community. In the spring, sometimes you get a more chlorinated taste because it might be using chlorine in your system. Other times of the year, it might taste more organic. Luckily, those are not toxic usually, but it's an indication of a disruption in the normal water. Toxicity is what a lot of us are concerned about. So a lot of the creatures that eat algae are filter feeders, and they start to bioaccumulate those toxins in their body. That's what killed manatees, is they were eating indirectly eating these little microorganisms that were on the plants that they were grazing. And when those animals were accumulating, you didn't know anything was wrong until they were stressed. So when there was stressful times, bad weather, some of the compromised manatees started to die off. And that was a red algae, actually a dinoflagellate, I'm sorry. So the three main groups that are most problematic or create the most toxins are the cyanobacteria, which still a lot of people call blue-green algae. We're not supposed to. They're not algae. Cool thing about cyanobacteria, they are what we believe to be the very first generators of oxygen in the earth. Before the cyanobacteria started to explode around the world in the primeval times, there was little oxygen in the atmosphere. It was inhospitable to creatures like us. So they're continuing to do that, generate oxygen, because they're photosynthesizers. Cyanobacteria, anybody know prokaryote versus eukaryote? Getting too technical. They are prokaryotic, so they don't have true organelles. Now I'm stressing you out, right? It's terminology. But if you look at a microscope, you have a decent microscope. You don't see a nucleus. You don't see chloroplasts. So that's one key that it's a cyanobacteria. They're called blue-green because that's their typical color, but they do vary. There's greenish-yellow cyanobacteria. They actually were pushed out of the algal world, but we still talk about them as being an algae. They're somewhere in between bacteria and algae. But they're really cool because they influence our environment. The other group is the dinoflagellates or dinoflagellates, which you probably have heard about. They're mobile organisms that swim around. The di comes from the Greek meaning to spin or whirl. It doesn't mean two. Because anyone ever look at one on the microscope? Really stretching it here.
Yep.
I'll just talk to you. So they have a hula hoop flagella that runs around their waist, and they also have the typical tail. So as they spin, as they travel through the water, they spin like a bullet, which makes them very directed in their movement, and that's why they gave it the word from the Greek, to spin or whirl. But you can also remember they also have two flagella. They're usually armored creatures. They have a crunchy shell, like the diatoms, which are also, it's the third group. The diatoms are non-modal. They're the ones that are like the Skittles. We call them the Skittles of the water world. Crunchy outside, they have a silica shell, and all their guts are inside. And they float. And they also, the diatoms and the cyanobacteria will they grow in different ways. Many of them are planktonic. So if I put out a plankton net and towed around here for a little while, we'd probably pick up some. And they also are benthic, and they're part of what we call the periphyton. So that's the films, the green films that are growing on everything, the old shoes, the beer cans, the rocks. So that's a great way to go out and sample algae when I'm sampling is you pick up some of the slimy, disgusting looking stuff and you take a cotton swab and you get that whole community that lives as that biofilm. And if you ever want to monitor how quickly the biofilm is produced, we now know that we can put a structure out there. Some people use microscope slides on a float, and you put like a series of them floating around the pond. You come back in 6 months, and then you can see what developed and get an idea of the community. Because usually when we go out to sample algae, it's just a snapshot, obviously. You get an idea of what's happening in July, but you might not be able to detect the others. So those are the three main groups that do cause problems. Most of them are harmless and important parts of the food chain, but there's just a few rogue algae that cause those toxins. The other important thing to remember about algae is they're a symptom. A lot of times we think of them as the cause of all our problems, but they're a symptom of a problem. That's how I like to talk about Phragmites, another lovely creature that we work with. Phragmites is a symbol that the drainage has changed. The hydrology has been messed up in the marsh. Salt water is not coming up because we've disrupted the salt marsh. And it usually follows, Phragmites as well as these algae follow human disturbance. So you get excess runoff. If you're a community around a pond that's in a basin, it's like a toilet. Everything drains downhill. All those nutrients, the dog and other animal waste, the fertilizer makes your nitrogen lawn look so green and you have to mow it 3 times a week. Those are the things that are causing these blooms. And freshwater bodies, usually when we're talking about lakes and ponds, you probably have heard of oligotrophic and eutrophic. So it's like this sliding scale. So more or less the extremes. The oligotrophic is low nutrient, sometimes acidic pH. A lot of nutrients are lacking. And then the eutrophic, we always think of that as a bad word, but sometimes ponds are just naturally eutrophied or eutrophic. It's a cycle of pond succession. And those are high nutrients, often high productivity plants and algae. But when they become extremely eutrophic, then you have the problem where you might have massive die-off of the vegetation and the algae, which causes decay, which then causes fish die-off, creatures that need oxygen. And then certain algae are indicative of those systems. There's these protists called rotifers, which you find a lot of them in oligotrophic ponds. This pond I sampled down in South County, that you find a lot of rotifers, but not a lot of else. And then in eutrophic systems, we find tolerant species, the survivors, like the euglenoids. You probably have seen euglena, that strange creature that's somewhere between an animal and a plant. They're an indicator that you have a stressed system, but they're survivors. So there's lots and lots of lists. I didn't reproduce these. Nowadays, as they say, you could Google it. You can get a list of indicator species that might give you a appreciation for what is the health of the system you're looking at. So euglenids are famous for living in horrible, eutrophied sewage waste overflow places. Not where you think of what well-respecting creatures should survive. But they're survivors. They photosynthesize, and they take in food. So they have a mouth that they can filter feed the stuff that's around them. Now, does anybody have questions as I go along? Yes.
Can understanding the species type help you know what mitigation strategies would be most effective?
It can. Yes, that's right. The question was, can understanding the species that you have influence your mitigation? And it certainly can, because we know that certain ones are like responders to nitrogen. So then you want to look at prevention of the runoff into your system. If you get a community profile, it can really first tell you, is your system compromised or is it a normal system? And then you can figure out what to do. And a lot of the things that we do recommend for preventing algal blooms is probably stuff most of you in the audience understand. Reduce or eliminate pesticides, fertilizers. If you do use them, luckily most towns, and I shouldn't say most, but a lot of landscaping companies are told to clean up anything that's left on the hard surfaces. Because that all runs downhill into the storm drain. I remember growing up that people used to dump stuff down the storm drains. One time someone dumped antifreeze and the stream behind my house ran bright green. Crazy. So enforce stormwater control systems. Vegetation obviously is better. So some people might wonder, why the heck is Audubon here? Well, because you're known as the forest and bird people. Well, those forests contain freshwater habitats. And the more you protect the upland, the more you're protecting the streams and rivers. And you can see this, if you're in a stream that's heavily urbanized or suburbanized, it'll run like chocolate milk after a storm. And if you're in a natural area, the water will stay mostly clean because the uplands are acting like the kidneys of the ecosystem, filtering the water, controlling the flow of water down into the basin. So that's very important. You have to think large, as you know, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, but you want to practice watershed management, not just pond management. Obviously, if we were truly wanting to stop from eutrophying, we'd probably want to blow out any containment, let the water flow more rapidly, but we don't want to drain it either. So obviously this is an extreme system, but if you're working in systems, you can apply a lot of what you see here and think about what to do and what not to do. Other questions? So remember to love your algae. Rebecca, do we have more time? Do we have more time?
I would say we have 10 minutes for questions.
Because I can talk more.